Shalom and welcome to another episode of The Case for Messiah. It's been a while, Golan.
Yes. I missed you.
I have too. And so today we're actually going to be talking about the prophet like Moses from Deuteronomy chapter 18. And I think this is going to be a really good discussion.
Amen.
Yeah. So that passage is obviously a very debated passage, but it's not debated in the New Testament. So, Deuteronomy 18 verses 15 through 19, there's a promise of a prophet like Moses.
An expectation for a prophet like Moses.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay. And so in Acts chapter 3, the New Testament writers, right, Peter in his sermon, he identifies that prophet as Yeshua.
Can you please read?
Yeah, so Acts chapter 3, verses 22 through 23, and then I'm going to skip down to verse 26. Moses said, "The Lord God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. To him you shall give heed to everything he says to you. And it will be that every soul that does not heed that prophet shall be utterly destroyed from among the people." Now skipping down to verse 26. "For you first God raised up," same word there, "raised up his servant and sent him to bless you by turning every one of you from your wicked ways." And so based on Peter's citation, we see that he's linking Deuteronomy 18 with Yeshua.
So he sees Yeshua as the prophet like Moses.
Correct. Absolutely. And a lot of work, scholars have done a lot of great work on Matthew and John, and both the Gospels are filled with parallels between Moses and Yeshua. And so there's a really good case to show that the Gospel writers understood the prophet like Moses also to be a messianic prophecy which was fulfilled in Yeshua.
So what's the problem?
Golan, there's always a problem, right? That's why we get together, only
That's
to
why
deal
we're
with
here.
problems. Okay. So what's the problem? Here's the problem. There are people that are very, that want to refute the New Testament faith, and people that aim to try to show that the New Testament has ripped, passages from the Hebrew Bible out of context. And so people that are kind of dedicated to trying to refute the New Testament faith have stated emphatically, that this interpretation, the messianic interpretation of Deuteronomy 18 is nonsense.
For two reasons?
For two reasons, correct.
Okay, the first reason?
Okay, so the first reason they argue is that Deuteronomy 18:15 was fulfilled long before Yeshua showed up by another guy that had the same name.
Same name?
Yehoshua, right? Joshua. And so that's one of the, that's the first kind of an
it already
argument.
was fulfilled in Joshua.
There's no future expectation beyond Joshua because Joshua is the prophet like Moses. And then the second argument is that Christians and the New Testament actually don't claim that Yeshua is like Moses anyway. So he's not the prophet like Moses because, according to the New Testament and according to Christians, right, Yeshua is God in the flesh. He's not like Moses.
Exactly.
And therefore, there's a mismatch. He's far greater than Moses, and that's also kind of goes against what the text actually says.
So let's start with the first reason.
Yeah, sure.
The first argument.
And actually, we're going to kind of come around because one of the arguments that I find surprising that's not mentioned by modern kind of opponents of the faith is Rashi's argument. And maybe I'll just quickly say what Rashi said. Rashi argues that, this passage of prophet like Moses is fulfilled by every prophet, and that being like Moses is being like Moses from among his brothers.
So every Israelite prophet, every prophet that came from Israel
is like Moses. Correct. And so, which is interesting. So these modern opponents of the faith are kind of not in agreement with Rashi. They're kind of more like the New Testament and saying it's fulfilled by one person. Okay. So we're going to touch that in a little bit. So let's take the first argument. The first argument is that the promise of Deuteronomy 18:15 through 19 was already fulfilled by Joshua. There's no need to think about a future fulfillment.
And there is truth to some of it, right?
In fact, the arguments are really, really strong. And it's almost impossible to deny that Joshua is a prophet like Moses.
And we're going to show that if you're looking at the text, it's pretty obvious.
Correct.
That
And
there's a comparison.
And in fact, the modern opponents of the New Testament faith are actually pointing to textual evidence. And so we can kind of go through some of it. And I've added some. So I've heard some of their arguments. And then I've actually found some more. So
there's
added.
a lot of comparison between Joshua and Moses.
Correct. In fact, I could spend probably a couple of hours on all the parallels between Joshua and Moses in the book of Joshua. But in Deuteronomy 18, 15 through 19, we see that there's a specific tie in Deuteronomy 34, 9. Okay. In other words, Deuteronomy 34, 9 applies this passage, or seemingly applies this passage, to Joshua. And then in Joshua 1, 17 through 18, again, there's an allusion to Deuteronomy 18, and it's applied to Joshua.
But can you give us examples? Can you read at least some part of the
so a key phrase in Deuteronomy 18, 15 is, you shall listen to him. So the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your countrymen. You shall listen to him. Deuteronomy 18, 15. What's interesting is that then in Deuteronomy 34, 9, we have a verse about Joshua. Now, Joshua, the son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him, and the sons of Israel listened to him, to Joshua, and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. And so when did the Lord command Moses to listen to him? Deuteronomy 18, 15. It's the same phrase. In other words, it's clear that Deuteronomy 34, 9 ties Joshua to the promised prophet like Moses. Also, again, in Deuteronomy 18 through 19, I'm going to read the verse. I will raise up a prophet from among their countrymen like you, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. It shall come about that whoever will not listen to my words, which he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him. Well, Joshua 1, 17 through 18 takes up that passage in the lips of the people, and they basically cite this passage and apply it to Joshua. They say, just as we obeyed Moses in all things, so we will obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. Anyone who rebels against your mouth, God said he would put his words in the mouth of the prophet, right? Anybody, who rebels against your mouth and does not obey your words in all that you command him shall be put to death, as in I will require it of him. Yeah. Only be strong and courageous. And so here we have very strong textual proof that Joshua is identified as a prophet like Moses. Deuteronomy 18. I mean, it's actually irrefutable.
And again, this is the tip of the iceberg. There's many more examples.
So again, Joshua 3:7, Joshua 4:14. Let me read Joshua 3:7. Yes. Now the Lord said to Joshua, this day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you. Again, so it's just pretty clear.
And then Joshua 4.
Joshua 4:14. On that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, so that they revered him just as they had revered Moses all the days of his life. And the word here for revered is feared. And this actually is an allusion to Exodus 14:31. And again, it's undeniable that Joshua is being presented as a prophet like Moses.
As the people feared Moses, they now fear Joshua.
Correct. And in fact, if you look at the stories and the narratives in the book of Joshua, it's really interesting because Joshua parts the waters.
Of the Jordan?
Of the Jordan. It's interesting that the scarlet thread in Rahab's window has been compared to the Passover and the blood on the lintels and the doorposts.
12.
Joshua meets this angel of the Lord, this captain of the host, and removes his shoes just like Moses. The final speech in Joshua 24 repeats it's very closely tied to Moses' final speech in Deuteronomy 30 and 31. Let me read Exodus 3:5. Then he, the Lord, said to Moses, do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground.
Yep.
Then it says in Joshua 5:15, the captain of the Lord's host said to Joshua, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. Joshua's being presented as a new Moses.
Yeah, Moses sends spies, Joshua is sending 2 spies, and there's other many comparisons, as you said.
Which is actually interesting because already just with this textual evidence, it kind of goes against what Rashi said. Rashi wanted to limit a prophet like Moses, like the fact that Moses came from the people of Israel, so the prophet. In other words, being like Moses is being from the people of Israel. But the book of Joshua clearly interprets like as going far beyond.
Yep.
It's not just in being Israelite. So here we see an interpretation that's in the Bible that kind of refutes.
Both in text and in narrative.
Correct. But what do? Right? In other words, we have a situation now where you have a really good case that
Joshua is a good candidate.
That Joshua's probably one of the best candidates.
Exactly.
And so what do? Does that mean then that the New Testament has taken this promise out of context? Have the New Testament authors, kind of failed to see the obvious that Joshua is that prophet? So how do we deal with these arguments? And so we were talking about this before. My PhD mentor.
You like to mention him.
I do. I love, he's with the Lord now. And he used to say something that I've never forgotten. He said, if we're ever going to make sense of the New Testament's use of the Old Testament, we have to first start understanding the Old Testament's use of the Old Testament. And so
you're saying the best interpretation of the Old Testament is in the Old Testament.
Yeah. And what we're going to see is that we actually have inner Hebrew Bible interpretations in the Hebrew Bible that actually help us realize that there's a lot of evidence in favor of the way the New Testament is reading that passage. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to actually look at these 2 arguments one by one. First, that Joshua fulfilled the promise.
Yep.
Second, that the New Testament also doesn't say that Jesus is like Moses. It says he's greater than Moses. We're going to look at that from the perspective of how the Hebrew Bible interprets itself.
Okay. So let's start, and you've noticed, and you told me before, that Joshua is not the only one in the Hebrew Bible which is being compared to Moses.
Yeah, so again, I find that, these recent attempts to kind of refute the New Testament because Joshua fulfilled the promise of a prophet like Moses, I think it just fails to consider that Joshua is not the only prophet like Moses in the Hebrew Bible. Several other examples, and these are Jewish scholars, Christian scholars, secular, religious scholars. We're just, atheist scholars, believing scholars. There are several prophets and figures in the Hebrew Bible that are presented as prophets like Moses. So Gideon in Judges chapter 6, his call narrative, he is called like Moses. He objects like Moses.
Yep.
Samuel, in 1 Samuel chapters 1 through 12, there's so many parallels between Samuel and Moses. I was just even reading today in my own personal study in chapter 12, the way that the text depicts Samuel there. He's a second Moses. He's a new Moses. He's a prophet like Moses. Elijah, fasts for 40 days, 40 nights. He goes and meets God in the mountain of God. And
he opens the river.
He opens the river. He's a Moses figure. He complains that the people are too burdensome for him, just like Moses. Jeremiah's call narrative, scholars have shown us that Jeremiah just, who am I? I can't talk. I can't do this. And in fact, God actually says to Jeremiah, I will put my words in your mouth. And that phrase is only found one other time in all of Scriptures, Deuteronomy 18.
To Moses. Yeah.
Prophet like Moses. And so what we see here is that Joshua actually did not fulfill the promise. And in this sense, we could say Rashi was right. Maybe Deuteronomy 18:15 is a group of prophets that are like Moses, not just in being like an Israelite, but in other things, in their calling, in some of the miracles that they do. Also,
but what about Genesis itself?
Genesis. And so I did some research on Genesis. I published an article where I looked at this whole notion of Maaseh Avot Siman Lebanim, the deeds of the fathers are assigned to the sons. There are many characters in the book of Genesis that actually prefigure Moses. So Noah also, saved in an ark like Moses. Moses was saved in an ark, it says, not a basket, an ark. Okay, you have Abraham that is brought out of Egypt, right? Just like Moses, just like Israel.
Yep.
Jacob is like Moses in certain key ways. Joseph, a slave in Egypt that rises to prominence in Pharaoh's house, marries the wife of an Egyptian prophet, right? So it's Egyptian priest, and so Joshua as well. Sorry, not Joshua. Sorry,
Joseph.
Joseph is like Moses.
Yep.
And so we say all this to simply say, to argue that Joshua fulfills Deuteronomy 18 just because of all the parallels in Joshua actually fails to account for all the other evidence that there are many prophets like Moses.
So you're saying Joshua is not the prophet like Moses? He's a prophet like Moses, like other figures in the Bible.
Correct. And so what we could also say is that all these references to comparing Moses and the prophets, we could actually say that it builds an expectation.
To the prophet like Moses.
Or we could expect at the very least that when the Messiah comes, he'll be like Moses too, right? So in that sense, we could say that Deuteronomy 18 extends to Yeshua, but there's more.
But that figures why in the rabbinic thought they call the Messiah the second Moses.
Correct.
Yeah.
And you've run ahead, and that's really good. And we're going to get there because we talked about this.
So let's tackle the second argument.
Yeah. So first argument, Joshua fulfilled the promise, but that's just not true. Mm-hmm. Joshua is one of the installments, as are many other figures in the Hebrew Bible. Yep. So it's a simplistic reading to say it's all over in Joshua, because it's not, okay? But now the second argument is kind of like the Christians don't claim that Yeshua is like Moses anyway. So Deuteronomy 18 has nothing to do with Yeshua, because Yeshua is greater than Moses, and therefore Deuteronomy 18 doesn't apply to Yeshua.
Okay, so what do we do with that argument? Because that seems to be a little more sophisticated.
Yeah. Before we can understand the New Testament's interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, we have to look at the Hebrew Bible's interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. And what's really interesting, okay, yes, Joshua and the other prophets are prophets like Moses, or we could say each one is a prophet. A prophet
like Moses.
Like Moses. But there is a big difference between a prophet like Moses and being the prophet like Moses. And why do I say that? Deuteronomy 18:15. Let me read the verse. Yep. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me. So this is what Moses promises, right? And he says that he'll come from your countrymen. You must listen to him, or you shall listen to him. But listen how the end of Deuteronomy, the last chapter of Deuteronomy actually cites this passage. And without getting too detailed, Deuteronomy 34 is definitely written. It's an add-on. It's a canonical addition to the Torah.
According to the Talmud, the 8 last verses of the Torah were written by Joshua.
Okay, but I would argue that it actually was probably added at the very end of the canonical process. And why do I say this? Let me read the verse, okay? Now Joshua the son of Nun was filled with the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. And the sons of Israel listened to him and did as the Lord had commanded him. Oh, he's a prophet like Moses. But notice what verse 10 says. Since that time, no prophet has arisen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face.
Yes.
So here's what's really interesting, is that in one sense, Joshua is a prophet like Moses, but like has a different meaning in Deuteronomy 34, verses 9 through 10, because here we're told as similar as Joshua is and as similar as the other prophets are to Moses, like has a meaning that at least here says there's never been the prophet like Moses.
Yes.
The way that Moses knew the Lord face to face, the miracles that Moses did. So in that sense, prophets are like Moses, but in another sense, there's never arisen a prophet like Moses, which means whoever wrote Deuteronomy 34
waiting.
is still waiting. In other words, the promise hasn't been fulfilled yet.
Yes.
All right. Now, let's look at a couple other passages. It's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
To assume that like also means equal, okay, has to means equal, is a bit of a problem when it comes to the Torah and when it comes to the eschatology of the prophets.
Why?
Why? If we look at the eschatology of the book of Deuteronomy, for instance, in Deuteronomy 4:25 through 31, and in Deuteronomy 30, verses 1 through 14, we see that Moses already anticipated, even before Israel entered the land, that they would be scattered, not just to one nation, but they would be scattered to the four corners of the earth.
They would be exiled to the four corners of the world, yes.
Correct. Okay. So if we're expecting a future prophet like Moses, he's going to have to be greater than Moses. Why? Because he's not just gathering Israel from Egypt, from one country. He's going to gather them from the four corners of the earth. And let me just read to you Deuteronomy 30, verse 3, verse 6, and then verses 11 through 14.
Yes.
Okay? Then the Lord your God will restore you from captivity and have compassion on you and will gather you from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. That's verse 3. Verse 6, moreover, the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul that you may live. Now, it's interesting that this whole notion of a circumcised heart, regathering in a circumcised heart, this is very similar to Jeremiah's new covenant, which means we've got a new covenant coming through a new Moses. Now, why would I say a new Moses? Notice verses 11 through 14 in Deuteronomy 30. For this commandment, okay, and I think he's talking about this new covenant commandment, which I command you today is not too difficult for you, nor is it out of reach. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will go up to heaven for us to get it for us and make us hear it, that we may observe it? Nor is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will cross the sea for us to get it for us and make us hear it, that we may observe it? But the word is very near you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may observe it. Scholars actually point out that this reference to going up to heaven to get it, going across the sea to bring it, that's an allusion to Moses. Moses going up to Mount Sinai to get the law, to going across the sea to rescue his people, and to bring them to Mount Sinai. And there's an ancient Aramaic translation of the Torah that draws this allusion. Notice, this is from Targum Neofiti. The Torah is not in the heavens saying, oh, that we had one like Moses the prophet who would go up to heaven and take it for us, that he might make us hear the commandments so that we would do them. In other words, the thought of a prophet like Moses, or the coming of the prophet like Moses, or a redeemer like Moses, in the Torah already suggests that he's going to have to be greater, because he's going to have to gather us, not just from one land, but from all the corners of the earth, and he has to give us a better covenant, a circumcised heart.
So we're talking about a Messiah like Moses, but even bigger than Moses.
Correct. Okay. Now, you would say, Seth, I don't believe you. I disagree with you. You're reading things into it. Well, then what do we do with the prophets? Because the prophets clearly understand a reference to the prophet like Moses as something that this prophet like Moses is going to be like Moses, but greater, and they actually identified him as the Messiah.
Like Isaiah?
Isaiah. Okay. Isaiah chapter 11 and 12, the rabbis agree. Isaiah chapter 11, it's about the Messiah. Messianic, right? Okay, he's definitely the Messiah, okay? But what's interesting is if you look at Isaiah 11 and 12, it shows that this Messiah is going to bring about a new Exodus.
A new Exodus.
A new Exodus. So notice, I'm going to be reading verses 10 through 12 and then verses 15 through 16. Then in that day, the nations will resort to the root of Jesse, the Messiah, who will stand as a signal for the peoples, and his resting place will be glorious. Then it will happen that on that day, the Lord will again recover the second time with his hand the remnant of his people. Now, when's the first time?
Exodus.
And how do we know this? In a minute, you're going to see he's going to mention the Exodus. So the first Exodus, now we're talking about a second Exodus. Okay, but notice he's going to do it a second time with his hand, the remnant of his people who will remain where? From Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamat, and from the islands of the sea. And he will lift up a standard for the nations and assemble the banished ones of Israel, and will gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. A greater Moses.
A greater Exodus.
Notice, and the Lord, I'm skipping down now to verses 15 and 16, and the Lord will utterly destroy the tongue of the sea of Egypt, and he will wave his hand over the river with his scorching wind, and he will strike it into 7 streams and make men walk over dry shod. That's just like the parting of the sea. And there will be a highway from Assyria for the remnant of his people who will be left. Here it is. Here proves this is a second Exodus, just as there was for Israel in the day that they came up out of the land of Egypt. In other words, here we have proof that Isaiah interpreted Isaiah 18 and a promised prophet like Moses.
Deuteronomy 18.
Deuteronomy 18. He interpreted Deuteronomy 18 as messianic. A Messiah who will even bring about a greater redemption than Moses.
So we have an interbiblical interpretation. The prophet like Moses is the Messiah and is greater than Moses.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Wow. And this is in the Hebrew Bible long before the New Testament. Okay? And in fact, what's really interesting, and we've done another podcast on Isaiah 53, the servant of the Lord, and we've shown in Isaiah 40 through 55, and you can resort to that, you can look at that podcast, we showed that a major theme in Isaiah's eschatology is a new Exodus.
By the way, when you say a servant of the Lord, I thought about Moses.
Exactly, because he's the servant of the Lord. But when you look at the servant of the Lord in Isaiah 40 through 55, we see that he's going to bring about an even greater Exodus, which means that the servant of the Lord is depicted as a greater Moses. And what's remarkable is that this is reflected in ancient rabbinic commentary.
For real?
Indeed. So Yalkut Shimoni on Isaiah 52 verse 13, you know that verse about, behold, my servant will prosper, he'll be greatly exalted, right? So notice what the ancient rabbi said about this passage. Behold, my servant will prosper. This is the King Messiah. He will be high and lifted up and greatly exalted. He will be more exalted than Abraham, of whom it is written, I will lift up my hand to the Lord. He will be lifted up above Moses, of whom it is written, you will say to me, lift it up to your bosom. Exodus 4, 4 through 6. And he will be exalted above the ministering angels, of whom it is written, their wheels were lofty and high. And that's in Ezekiel. For as it is said, who are you, exalted mountain? Zechariah 4, because he is greater than the patriarchs. And so I would argue that even those modern people, the modern opponents that are trying to refute the New Testament interpretation of the New Testament interpretation of Deuteronomy 18, not only are they ignoring the way that later prophets identify that passage as messianic, they're even ignoring ancient Jewish commentary that agrees with the New Testament.
Let alone the Bible itself, the Old Testament itself.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, so conclusion.
Yep.
The attempt to refute the New Testament's interpretation of Deuteronomy 18, verses 15 through 19, it not only fails to grasp the Old Testament's interpretation of Deuteronomy 18, 15 through 19, but also selectively ignores the Jewish interpretations of the servant of the Lord in Isaiah 52, verse 13.
That's on one hand. And on the other hand, the Gospel of Matthew, right?
So when Matthew presents Yeshua as the prophet like Moses, who is also Emmanuel, as greater than Moses, Matthew is actually presenting an interpretation that's deeply rooted in the Hebrew Bible. He's saying that Yeshua is not just a prophet like Moses, he is the prophet like Moses, and he is Israel's greater redeemer. He's not just like Moses, he's greater than Moses, just like the prophets promised, and just as our ancient interpreters said he would be.
So the Messiah, the servant of the Lord, is the Messiah, is the prophet like Moses, but he's much bigger than him.
Exactly. And so it would be good to finish with, I think, one of the most amazing citations. It shows up in a commentary called Ecclesiastes Rabbah, chapter 1, verse 9. And here's an ancient commentary that compares the Messiah with Moses. Ready for this?
Yep.
That which has been is that which shall be. Ecclesiastes 1:9. Rabbi Berechiah said in the name of Rabbi Isaac, as the first Redeemer was,
Moses,
so shall the latter Redeemer be. What is stated of the former Redeemer? And Moses took his wife and his sons and set them upon a donkey. Exodus 4:20. Similarly, will it be with the later Redeemer, as it is said, lowly and riding upon a donkey. Zechariah 9:9. As the former Redeemer caused manna to descend, as it is said, behold, I will cause to rain bread from heaven for you. Exodus 16:4. So will the latter Redeemer cause manna to descend, as it is said, may he be a rich cornfield in the land. Psalm 72:16. As the former Redeemer made a well to rise, so will the latter Redeemer bring up water, as it is said, and a fountain shall come forth out of the house of the Lord and shall water the valley of Shittim. Joel 4:18. Here we have it.
It's amazing. So they compare Moses to the last Redeemer, and they're saying he's a bigger Redeemer because the redemption is bigger and final.
Absolutely. And so here we have it. The Bible's defense of the Bible, or the Hebrew Bible's defense of the New Testament. Dear friends, you can search for yourselves and see. Read the book of Matthew, read the book of John, read the book of Acts, and you will see that the ways in which they presented Yeshua are not only fully in line with the Hebrew Bible and the promise of the prophet like Moses, but they understand that Yeshua is for us, for the Jewish people, and also for the Gentiles, the new Moses.
Amen. Thank you, Seth.